The letter came on a Tuesday, tucked between bills and grocery store flyers. Its envelope was thick, parchment-colored. The ink faded like it had traveled too far to get here. His name was written in a hand he didn't recognize, but the return address was burned into memory. Silver Ridge, New Mexico, a place he hadn't thought about in over a decade. He stood by the kitchen sink, city traffic murmuring through the apartment walls, and stared at the thing like it might bite. When he opened it, the smell of paper and dust rose up like a ghost. 3 lines changed everything. Your Uncle William passed. You've inherited the ranch. Come claim it, or it goes to auction. He didn't cry. They hadn't spoken in 13 years. But something in his chest cracked. Not grief exactly, but the strange ache of unfinished chapters. 2 weeks later, he found himself driving down a cracked desert road, his truck coughing on the incline, the land stretching out wide and wild on both sides. Silver Ridge wasn't marked on most maps. The last sign he saw was nailed to a leaning post, half swallowed by weeds, reading, McAllister Ranch, no trespassing. He remembered that sign. He remembered sitting in the back of his mother's old car, the smell of horse sweat and leather, the way his uncle's voice used to sound when he told him stories of the land. He remembered leaving, too. Fast, quiet, permanent. The ranch looked exactly like time forgot it. The wooden gate hung crooked on one hinge, half of it splintered. Dried sage brushed against his boots as he stepped out. The house stood in the distance, an old 2-story structure with sagging windows and chipped green paint, looking like it was held together more by memory than wood. The wind was dry, scratching through the broken wind chimes that still hung by the porch. It smelled like dust and rust and something older, something buried. He walked through the front door without a key. The lock had long since given up. The inside was worse. Furniture draped in white sheets, mouse droppings in corners, old whiskey bottles lined like forgotten soldiers on the fireplace mantel. On a table near the window, a photograph sat, face down. He turned it over. It was him and his uncle, both younger, standing beside a chestnut horse. His uncle had one hand on his shoulder, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. He looked at it longer than he meant to. Then he set it back down, gently. The house creaked when he moved, not in the usual way old wood does, but in a way that felt watchful, like something was still here, listening. He shook the thought and got to work. First came air. Windows thrown open, letting the sun slice through the dust. Then water, checking pipes, finding the pump still worked, though barely. He didn't think about staying, not yet. But something made him linger longer than he'd planned. As the sun lowered behind the hills, the land turned gold. A kind of silence settled that you only find in places the world has forgotten. It wasn't peaceful, not exactly. It was expectant. The barn called to him at dusk. It stood behind the house, tall and silvered by weather, its doors slightly ajar. The hinges moaned when he pulled them open, as if the building resented being woken. Inside, the light filtered through slats in the wood, creating long stripes of amber across the hay-strewn floor. Dust motes swirled like ash. The air was thicker in here, warm with the scent of old straw and something else. Something faintly sweet, like wildflowers left too long in the sun. He stepped inside, boots crunching on the floor. Tools hung neatly along one wall, their edges rusted. A saddle sat in the corner, cracked but familiar. He ran his fingers along it, remembering the way his uncle used to lift him onto horses too big for him, laughing like the world would never end. He turned to leave, and then he heard it. A sound, soft, above. He froze. It wasn't the creak of wood or the groan of wind. It was something human, a shift, a breath held too long. His eyes rose to the loft, the hayloft. The upper level was shadowed, the ladder leading up worn but sturdy. For a moment, he thought of walking away. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, waiting. He stepped toward the ladder slowly, each bootfall measured. The wood creaked under his weight. As he reached the top, he moved carefully, scanning the dark with narrowed eyes. And then, in the far corner, nestled among flattened hay, he saw her. A girl. She was curled up, half covered in a worn blanket, her hair tangled, her breathing slow and even. She didn't wake when he moved closer, though her brow twitched slightly like she was caught in a restless dream. She didn't look dangerous, but she didn't look safe either. She looked like someone who hadn't meant to be found. He stood still, not daring to speak, just staring. The golden light of sunset filtered through the loft, falling across her face. And all at once, the silence of the house made sense. The feeling of being watched, the fresh footprints in the dirt. This ranch wasn't empty. It never had been. He stood frozen at the top of the hayloft, eyes fixed on her as if blinking might make her vanish. The girl didn't stir at first. Her breathing remained slow, steady, as if the very presence of another person hadn't pierced the air. She was curled like an animal, used to sleeping lightly. One hand tucked beneath her head, the other resting on her chest, where a sliver of silver glinted against her collarbone. A necklace. Small, old. Maybe something she hadn't taken off in years. A whisper of hay shifted under his boot, and her eyes snapped open. They were green, not soft green, but sharp, like bottle glass that had caught the sun just right. She didn't scream, didn't leap or scramble or plead. She only stared, like someone who'd long rehearsed what to do if this exact moment came. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket with her like it was armor, though her posture said she didn't feel the need to hide. He raised both hands slightly, more out of instinct than any real plan. "Hey, I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice low, like they were in a church or some kind of sacred, forgotten place. "You didn't," she said flatly. Her voice was dry but steady, like someone used to hard beds and harder mornings. "You're trespassing." That surprised him. He blinked. "Pretty sure it's my barn." She tilted her head, unconvinced. "Doesn't feel like anybody's barn. Looks like it's been dying for a long time." He didn't argue. Instead, he sat down slowly on a beam nearby, keeping some distance, but staying close enough to let her know he wasn't just going to leave. Dust hung thick between them, swaying in the thin light from the window slats. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside, the wind, the sun, the hush of the forgotten land, felt very far away. "Name's Luke," he offered eventually. "Just got here yesterday. Inherited the place." She didn't give her name. She just studied him, eyes narrowing like she was reading something behind his words. "I'm just passing through," she said after a long pause. "That's not really an answer," he replied gently. "It's all you're getting." There wasn't defiance in her voice. Not exactly. More like exhaustion dressed as stubbornness. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, but there was something older about her, something that didn't match the smoothness of her skin or the softness of her features. A weight, a history. Luke glanced around the loft. There was a small pack tucked behind a beam, barely visible. A water bottle. An old book with a broken spine. The blanket was worn but neatly folded on one side, like she'd been here more than a night. He thought of the fresh footprints by the fence, the feeling of being watched from the moment he arrived. She hadn't just wandered in. She'd been here. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. He climbed down and returned 10 minutes later with a half loaf of bread, some jerky, and a bottle of water. When he reached the loft again, she was sitting up straighter, arms folded. She took the food but didn't thank him, at least not with words. Just a small nod, and the way her shoulders dropped slightly, like maybe she didn't expect kindness and wasn't sure what to do with it. They sat in silence while she ate. When she finished, she wiped her hands on her jeans and finally looked him in the eye again. "You shouldn't let people stay," she said. "Not in places like this. It makes you soft." "I didn't say you could stay," he said, though there was no heat in it. He didn't want her gone, not really. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the mystery. Maybe it was the way she seemed stitched into the fabric of the place, like she belonged to the ranch more than he ever could. She shrugged. "Then don't." That night, he didn't sleep well. Every creak of the old house felt like a question he couldn't answer. He found himself thinking about her. How guarded she was, how she looked both out of place and completely rooted to the land. There was something in her stillness that disturbed him, not in fear, but in curiosity. She wasn't running, she was hiding, and he didn't know which was more dangerous. At dawn, the house was silent. He made coffee and walked out to the barn, the sun not yet over the ridge. The loft was empty, the blanket was gone. So was the pack. No note, no goodbye, just absence. He climbed the ladder slowly, hoping, irrationally, to still catch her curled in the corner. But there was only flattened hay and a few strands of long copper hair. He turned to go when something caught his eye. A small wooden token tucked beside the beam. He crouched and picked it up. It was carved, roughly but with intention. A horse's head, barely larger than a coin, with a single letter burned into the back. J. He turned it over in his palm, once, twice. It wasn't much, but it was something. A breadcrumb, a message, or maybe just a signature. She was gone. But she hadn't vanished. She had left a mark. The morning light was soft when Luke stepped outside, cradling a cup of coffee like it was the only warmth he could trust. The ranch was still. Still in the way old places got when they'd stopped expecting anyone to care for them. Dust swirled low along the porch steps. The boards beneath his boots creaked like they were stretching after years of silence. He was halfway through his first sip when he saw her. She was in the garden. The garden was a mess, more weeds than vegetables, and yet she moved through it like someone who'd never left. Her hands, though bare, didn't flinch at thorns or burrs. She tugged vines aside with familiarity, her fingers brushing the soil like it was sacred. Her hair was tied back this time, a dark auburn mess secured by twine. And her boots were caked with mud that looked weeks old. She hadn't just found this place. She belonged to it. Luke didn't call out. He walked quietly, approaching from the side gate so as not to startle her. though a part of him already knew she wouldn't be surprised. She glanced at him over her shoulder as he neared, her expression unreadable. Not cold, not warm, but practiced. "You came back," he said, unsure whether it was an accusation or relief. "I never left," she replied, turning her attention back to a stubborn squash vine. "You just stopped looking." That puzzled him. "You're not passing through, are you?" "I didn't say I was," she said simply, standing and wiping her hands on her jeans. There was a silence between them that stretched into something almost fragile. The kind that could break if you leaned on it too hard. Luke studied her closely now. The smudge of dirt across her cheek, the scrape on her wrist, the faint white line near her jaw. Not fresh, but not old either. She was all shadows and fragments, a jigsaw puzzle without a box lid. "What's your name?" he asked, softer this time. She looked past him, toward the hills. "Names are heavy," she said, "and sometimes dangerous." "That's supposed to mean something?" She hesitated, then turned back to him with a shrug. "It means you don't need it yet." Luke didn't push. He knew better than to pry when a person was holding themselves together with secrets. Instead, he nodded toward the garden. "You know your way around it, around the ranch." She gave a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. It was crooked, barely there, but it changed her face entirely. "I used to grow tomatoes here when I was little, before the drought." It stopped him cold. "You lived here?" Her smile vanished as quickly as it came. "A long time ago." He wanted to ask more. Who raised her here? Why she left? Why she was hiding? But she turned away and walked back toward the barn like the subject was done. Luke watched her go, that carved token still heavy in his pocket, pressing against 100 questions he didn't know how to ask. Later that afternoon, he drove into town. It was the first time he'd left the ranch since arriving, and the road felt foreign beneath his tires. Too smooth, too straight after days of dust and crooked fences. The town was small. A general store, a diner, a bar, and a sheriff's office, with one truck parked out front and dust on the windows. He stopped for gas, more out of ritual than need. Inside the store, an old man behind the counter was watching a black and white western on a portable TV. Luke grabbed a few supplies, coffee, nails, canned beans, and dropped them on the counter. As the man rang them up, Luke asked casually, "Anyone ever go missing round here?" The old man didn't answer right away. He scratched his chin, looked out the window like the memory might be hiding there. "Plenty do," he said finally. "But you mean someone specific?" "Not sure," Luke said. "Heard something about a girl, maybe years back." The man's face shifted. Not alarm, but something quieter. Sadness, maybe, or weariness. "You talking about the Hayes girl?" Luke shrugged, playing dumb. "Maybe." Disappeared when she was 16. Father found her bike in the river, but no body. Sheriff searched for weeks, but nothing ever came of it. Some say she ran away. Others think, well. He paused. "That land's got a strange feel to it. Always did." "What was her name?" Luke asked. The man looked at him strangely, like he wasn't sure if Luke was asking for the sake of knowing or the sake of confirming. "June," he said. "June Hayes. Pretty thing. Real quiet. Kinda like a shadow, even when she was in the sun." Luke nodded slowly. That crooked smile, those sharp green eyes. They were all he could picture now. Back at the ranch, the girl was gone again. No trace in the barn, nothing in the garden. Only the memory of her movements, the echo of her voice. He stood in the field as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant storms. The land whispered something he couldn't quite make out. He pulled the wooden token from his pocket again and turned it over. J. He'd thought it might mean Jane, Julia, just a trinket. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe it wasn't just a letter. Maybe it was a name, or a warning, or both. The house groaned like an old man in his sleep, every board creaking under the weight of time and secrets. Luke had decided, finally, to start cleaning it out. Not just the dust and cobwebs, but the boxes, the broken chairs, the rusted tools hanging like ghosts in the hallway. The air inside the ranch house was dry and brittle, smelling of forgotten things. He worked in silence, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the back of his shirt as he shifted through the rooms heavy with history. In the study, behind a battered desk and beneath a loose floorboard, he found the letters. They were bundled with twine, fragile with age, tucked beside a rusted key and an empty whiskey bottle. The envelopes were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Spindly, impatient, and unmistakably that of his late uncle, Randall Wyatt. Luke sat on the edge of the desk, thumbing through them with a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. Most of the letters were addressed to a woman named L.M. Someone Luke had never heard of. The first few were mundane. Updates about the land, how dry the winter had been, how the cattle were failing. But then the tone shifted. Words sharpened. The writing grew erratic, emotional. One letter read, "She's still here. I swear to God, I see her out by the tree line at night. A child should not linger like that. Not after what happened." Luke's fingers tightened around the paper. Another letter followed. "The fire was supposed to be the end of it. You said it would wash everything clean, but I hear her. Sometimes I think she's waiting for me to die, to finish what we couldn't." He read it twice. Then again. A fire, a child, something that never left. By the fourth letter, the tone had darkened entirely. "You made the promise, not me. I buried the debts. I buried the family name. And still she lingers. If you'd come back when I asked, maybe she wouldn't be haunting these halls. But now it's on me. All of it." Luke stood up abruptly, the letter trembling in his hand. He turned toward the window, heart racing. The land outside looked the same. Sun-bleached grass, quiet wind, endless sky. But now it felt like a lie. A mask over something rotten. He went outside. The barn was empty, the garden abandoned. He scanned the hills, eyes darting to the tree line. And then he saw her, or the shadow of her, near the well, crouched low, watching him. He called out, "Hey!" She didn't move. "I found letters," he said, stepping closer. "From my uncle. About you." Still, she said nothing. "You lived here, didn't you? Not just when you were little. You never left." That got her attention. Her eyes flicked up, not afraid, not ashamed, just wary. "There was a fire," he said. "Something bad happened, and you—" She bolted. Like a deer flushed from brush, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the dry earth, scattering dust behind her. Luke shouted her name, or what he thought was her name. "June!" But it didn't stop her. If anything, it made her run faster. She disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the hills. Luke didn't follow. Not yet. He stood there, breath heavy, as the pieces clicked together in his mind. The familiarity she had with the land, the scars, the carved token, the way the old man in town had spoken about her. A shadow, even in the sun. His uncle hadn't just known her. He'd failed her. Luke went back into the house, the letters still clenched in his hand. He laid them out on the table, eyes scanning again for names, dates, anything. There were no photographs, no confession, just half-told stories, guilt bleeding through ink. But it was enough. This girl, June or whoever she truly was, had lived through something on this ranch. Something cruel, something buried. And now she was running from it all over again. But this time, Luke wouldn't let her disappear into the dust. The sky turned a sick shade of gray by mid-afternoon, bruised and boiling over with something that felt ancient and wild. Thunder rumbled low like a growl across the plains, and wind rolled in, fierce and restless. Luke stood on the porch, hand gripping the post, eyes on the horizon. He'd lived in the city long enough to forget how storms felt out here. Big, brutal things that swept in without apology. But this one wasn't just weather. It felt like a warning. She was still gone. It had been 2 days since she ran into the hills, and not a trace of her since. No footprints, no sign, just the silence of the land swallowing everything whole. But Luke couldn't sit still anymore. Not after the letters. Not after what he suspected. As fat drops of rain began to fall, he saddled up the old paint horse that had come with the ranch, slapped his hat on, and rode out toward the ridge. Wind clawed at him, biting through his coat. The air was thick, alive with the scent of dust and electricity. The first flash of lightning lit the sky just as he reached the old fence line. And then the rain came down hard, like a curtain dropped all at once. He yelled her name into the storm, no answer. He searched the foothills, the creek bed, the twisted grove of cottonwoods where the cattle once wandered. And then, through sheets of rain and crackling thunder, he saw the ruins. What remained of the old chapel his uncle once mentioned. Just a stone shell on the far end of the property, hidden by thyme and thickets. Something told him to check there. He dismounted, tied the reins to a post half swallowed by vines, and stepped carefully through the mud and shattered brick. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the inside. And there she was, curled beneath the fractured archway, soaked to the bone, but calm, watching him like she'd been waiting all along. Luke didn't speak right away. He approached slowly, breathing hard from the climb and the storm. His clothes clung to him like second skin, rain dripping from his brow. "I told you not to follow," she said quietly. "You didn't tell me much of anything," he replied, crouching beside her. "I read the letters. I know." "No." She shook her head. "You don't." He waited. She looked down at her hands, fingers dirty, nails cracked. "I was born here. In this chapel, actually. My mother, her name was Lydia. She was your uncle's housekeeper once. Not officially. Not on paper, just someone he took pity on after she came west with nothing." Luke's breath caught, but he said nothing. She was young when she got pregnant. No one knew who the father was, not even her. She said it didn't matter. Her voice trembled slightly. Randall let her stay, promised to keep her safe. When I was born, he said I could stay too, but only if I stayed hidden. "Hidden," Luke echoed. She nodded, eyes fixed on the chapel's broken rafters. He said the world didn't need to know about me, that people wouldn't understand, that the town would talk, that it would ruin everything. So I lived in the shadows, in barns, sheds, attics, always nearby but never seen. Luke felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of anger and heartbreak. "And when your mother died?" he asked softly. "She got sick," she whispered. "There was no doctor. No one even knew she was here. Randall buried her in the hills, said we couldn't tell anyone, that her death was just another secret to keep." Lightning cracked again, closer this time. The storm swirled like it wanted to swallow them both. "Why stay?" Luke asked. "After all that, why not leave?" "I tried," she said. "More than once. But something always pulled me back. This land, it's the only home I've ever known. And I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd change. That he'd let me be real. But he didn't. He kept me tucked away like a shadow until the day he died." Luke sat back on his heels, the storm raging just outside the crumbled walls. He looked at her, this woman who had grown up in silence, who had survived in the cracks of someone else's life. The mystery of her wasn't just a story now. It was a wound, and he felt the sting of it deep. "He wrote in one of the letters," Luke said, voice thick, "that he thought you were still haunting him, that he saw you at night near the tree line." She gave a sad smile. Maybe he did. Maybe guilt makes ghosts of us all. He reached for her hand gently. She didn't pull away. "You're not a secret anymore," he said. "Not if you don't want to be." For a moment, the rain outside seemed to soften, as if the storm itself was listening. Her fingers laced with his, tentative but real. She looked at him, really looked. And for the first time since he arrived, her eyes weren't full of caution, but of hope. And for the first time, Luke felt like this ranch, broken, battered, and haunted, might become something else. A beginning. Chapter 7. The ranch was never empty. Word count 1,000. Legal documents surface, revealing twisted truths. The girl's mother once owned the land. The uncle never told anyone she survived. Ranch legally belongs to her, not him. He feels betrayed, but also realizes this land was never truly his. He must decide, fight for it, or give it to her. The next morning brought more than just heat and dust. It brought truth wrapped in brittle paper and buried intentions. Luke found the envelope tucked beneath a pile of discarded invoices in his uncle's old desk. The corners yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably Randall's. There were dates on the back: 2003, 2006, 2011, and a county seal pressed faintly into the paper. Something about it felt heavier than it looked. He unfolded it slowly. The land returns to Randall Nash. But there was no death certificate, no record of passing, just silence. He sat down hard in the old wooden chair, letting the paper fall into his lap. The room around him dimmed, like the walls knew what he'd just discovered. His hands trembled as he picked up the rest of the stack. Tucked among them were old letters written by Randall, addressed to lawyers and state offices. The tone of them wasn't cold. It was desperate, protective, panicked. "The girl must never be known," one read. "She was born into flame and shadow. She is not a mistake. But the world would treat her as one." Luke stared at those words for a long time. The girl, The child. Her. She wasn't just some lost soul hiding in the rafters. She wasn't a mystery dropped into his life from the fog of grief. She was the rightful heir. The soil was in her blood. The ranch, by law and legacy, belonged to her. He stepped outside and found her by the old water pump, filling a rusted bucket. She looked up as he approached, read his face before he even spoke. "You found it," she said. He didn't answer, just handed her the deed. She held it delicately, as if afraid the ink might vanish if she breathed too hard. Her eyes scanned the lines, and he watched the truth land on her shoulders like a familiar weight. Not surprise, something closer to confirmation. She had always known, deep down. She just never expected it to matter. "My mother never left this place," she whispered. "Even after the fire. Even after they said she had no right to stay." "Your mother owned this ranch," Luke said quietly. "Long before I even knew it existed." She nodded, still staring at the paper. "Randall promised to protect it. To protect me. He told me if I stayed hidden, it would be safe. I thought it was just fear. But he was afraid of the world taking it from me. From us." Luke looked past her, out toward the hills that rolled like sleeping giants in the distance. The land had never felt more alive than it did now, and never less like his. He wasn't angry, not really, but he felt the sting of betrayal. Randall had written him out of this truth, had given him a legacy built on silence. Luke had come here to claim something that was never meant to be his in the first place. And all this time, while he'd been fixing fences and painting dreams, the ranch had already chosen its keeper. "I didn't know," he said, more to the wind than to her. "I thought I was building something new, but it turns out I was trespassing in someone else's memory." She stepped forward, eyes soft but unreadable. "You weren't trespassing," she said. "You were healing it in ways I never could." He looked at her. The girl who once hid in haylofts now stood firm, steady in the sun. She wasn't just part of this land. She was it. And he was just passing through. A city man with clean hands who'd thought he could plant roots in soil he didn't understand. "I can fight this," he said after a moment. "If you want, legally. Technically, Randall's will gave it to me. There are ways to—" "No," she interrupted gently. "This land has seen enough fighting." They stood in silence. The kind of silence that feels like an answer. Luke thought about the city, about the apartment that still had boxes waiting for him, about the job offer that hadn't expired yet. He imagined walking away, selling the land back to the town, letting go. Then he imagined her, alone again, hands in the dirt, defending something sacred from people who only saw acres and profit. And he knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't leave. But he also couldn't take what wasn't his. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "This ranch is yours. But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay." She looked at him, really looked at him. Not as the stranger who arrived, dusty and lost. Not as the man who nearly claimed what wasn't his. But as someone who had chosen her. Not out of obligation, or legacy, or law, but out of heart. "I'd like that," she said. And just like that, something shifted. The ranch, long haunted by ghosts and guilt, took a breath. And for the first time in decades, it felt like home for both of them. The morning he signed the papers, the wind was still. The fields beyond the porch rustled gently under the weight of dawn. And the house, once hollow with memory, now felt full. of breath, of meaning, of the quiet rhythm of two lives slowly stitching themselves together. Luke sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, the deed laid out before him. His name, written boldly across Randall's inheritance, was about to disappear, and he was at peace with it. "This was never mine to begin with," he said, more to the walls than to her. But she heard him. She always did. She stood in the doorway, silent, watching as he signed his name one last time, this time not to claim, but to release. There was no ceremony, no grand gesture, just ink on paper and a promise in his heart. The land had always belonged to her, not because of legalities or bloodlines, but because of something far deeper. She was rooted here, in the wind, the wildflowers, the broken fence posts, and old creek beds. He had only ever been a visitor. When he looked up, she was already by his side. She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She simply took the papers, folded them with care, and placed them in the drawer of Randall's desk, where the past belonged. Then, without a word, she reached out and took his hand. Not because she owed him anything, but because she chose him. Their love didn't bloom like wildfire. It grew slow, like the roots of a stubborn cottonwood, deep and silent and immovable. They never spoke of love in grand declarations. It lived instead in small things, in the way she handed him coffee in the morning without asking how he slept, in the way he fixed the broken hinge on the stable door before she even noticed it was loose, in the shared glance across a sunlit field, or the echo of boots on floorboards in rhythm side by side. They stayed, not out of necessity, not out of guilt, but because the ranch asked them to, because the land, in all its broken beauty, had room for both of them now. Together, they began to rebuild, not just the structures that had rotted or fallen, but the very spirit of the place. They mended the barn roof one afternoon, laughing as the hammer slipped from his hand, and she caught it with the ease of someone who'd been climbing rafters her whole life. They replanted the garden in the back, sowing vegetables alongside wildflowers, letting beauty grow beside utility. They reopened the stables next, cleaned them out, repaired the latches, and oiled the old saddles. Horses came soon after. First 2 from a neighbor down the road, then 3 more from a family that had moved to the city and needed someone to care for them. Luke watched her with the animals, how they calmed under her hand, how they seemed to recognize her. And for the first time, he realized something he hadn't before. The land didn't just belong to her. She belonged to it, in the way a mountain belongs to the sky, in the way roots belong to earth. Over time, townsfolk began to return, curious at first. Rumors had swirled for months about the strange girl in the hills, the newcomer from the city, the inheritance drama. But when they saw the stables open again, the fences mended, the old trail restored, they softened. They came with pies and tools, with quiet apologies and old stories. And though the girl, no, the woman, was slow to trust, she let them in, little by little. One evening, as the last rays of sun stretched long across the hayfield, Luke stood beneath the hayloft and looked up. The window was open, the old shutters swinging lazily in the breeze. Light poured through it like a golden stream, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. She leaned against the frame above, elbows resting on the ledge, eyes on the horizon. He smiled. "Do you remember?" he asked. She nodded. "I was asleep. Thought you were a ghost." He laughed softly, You were barefoot, covered in hay. You were wearing that stupid leather belt, she teased. Still do. He looked down at it and chuckled. Some habits die hard. She climbed down the ladder slowly, barefoot again. He waited for her, boots planted in the soil, heart steady. She reached him and slipped her hand into his, fingers threading naturally, like the pages of a well-worn book. The sun dipped lower. In that moment, the past didn't disappear, but it softened. The shadows of fire, of loss, of silence. They still lingered, but they no longer ruled the place. In their stead grew wildflowers and laughter, and the kind of peace that only comes after choosing to stay. They didn't talk about forever. Not that night. Not ever, really. Forever wasn't something they needed to name. It was something they lived. In every fence they fixed, every meal they shared, every morning they woke up to the creak of floorboards and the smell of dirt and honeysuckle. The land had never truly been empty. It had simply been waiting, waiting for someone who would listen to its silence, waiting for a girl with no name to find her way home, waiting for a stranger with tired eyes and steady hands to choose belonging over ownership. As they stood beneath the open hayloft window, sunlight washing over their faces, something unspoken passed between them. It was not the end of their story. It was just the beginning.